Hey everyone, it's Blake here from ChessPathways.com, and today we're going to be talking about the King's Indian attack. The King's Indian attack is an opening setup that white can employ, and it can be reached through a variety of move orders. We're going to talk about that later in this video, but I'll just show the general setup first. The King's Indian is characterized by these first 7 moves from white. White can play knight f3, black can play d5 grabbing the center, g3, bishop g2, d3, knight b to d2, and then finally white's going to strike at the center here with e4, and finally castle to the king side. This is the setup white's going for, and we see that it doesn't really matter what black's doing in the meantime. There's not a whole lot that black can do to stop white from reaching this setup. If black were ever to exchange on e4, that's no problem. White can just recapture back, and we see that this knight on d2 stops black from just exchanging queens if that were to occur. This has made the King's Indian attack popular with a lot of players, because it doesn't require as much memorization as a lot of other opening systems. Understanding the key ideas is a lot more important. So what are the ideas here? White is often going to try to launch a kingside attack. White can sometimes push this pawn to e5 to drive this knight away. This knight can sometimes swing over to the king side through the f1 square, either to g3 or to h2 and g4, and white is going to try to build up pressure there on the king side. Meanwhile, black could try to play on the queen side. They have a space advantage on that side of the board. Sometimes an idea with rook b8 and b5 and b4 or c4 could be tried from black, trying to generate play over there. And this can lead to some pretty exciting games. So let's take a look at how the game could progress from here. Black usually goes ahead and castles. That move makes a lot of sense. Now white generally plays rook to e1, getting ready to advance this pawn to e5 and get a space advantage. e5 could be played right away, but then after knight to d7, this pawn's under attack. We see black has 2 attackers on it, white only has 1 defender, so then rook e1 would probably have to be played anyways to go ahead and defend that pawn. So in the main line we have rook e1, black can play b5, trying to expand on the queen side, e5, knight d7, and now knight to f1. This key move, opening up this bishop and trying to swing this knight around to the king side, where it can participate in the king side attack. Black has tried all kinds of different moves here. Because there's no pawn tension in the position, both sides kind of have a free hand to play how they want to play here. Black has tried b4, rook b8, a5, all these moves advancing on the queen side. Even f6 has been tried from black, trying to strike back against this white pawn that's advanced here on e5. But this is always a little dangerous to do for black, a little bit double-edged, and white of course knows this when they're going for this setup, that it's not going to be easy for black to try to fight back on the king side. Because after, for example, e takes f6, bishop takes f6, now this rook is opened up, this e-pawn is possibly a target here. I saw one game continued here with bishop h3 piling up on this e6 pawn, and white went on to win that game. The most popular move, though, after knight f1 remains a5, so we can take a look at this. Now white plays here h4 most often, and this is a nice multi-purpose move. Not only does this get more control of the g5 square, possibly for a knight or bishop later on, but it also frees up the h2 square for this knight to come to. This knight is coming to h2 and possibly later on to g4. A couple games here have continued with b4, and now bishop f4, bishop a6, both sides bringing that bishop into the game. Black possibly thinking about expanding here on the queen side further with c4 later on. And now white plays knight 1 to h2, a4, and here white can play a3. White doesn't have to play this move. White could just continue with their ideas on the king side. But if white doesn't play a3, and black is simply allowed to play something like c4 and bringing the queen and rook into the game on b8 and b6, and then either c3 or a3, this could really start to undermine the white pawns here on the queen side. So white sometimes takes time out here and plays this move a3, just trying to slow black down a little bit. White's threatening to take on b4 and open a nice little file here for the rook, so black will usually exchange on a3 and now play rook b8, grabbing the open file. And now after knight g5, the battle lines are pretty clearly drawn here. White has a lot of pressure here on the king side, whereas black has an advantage over on the queen side. Black can try to play c4 at some point, open up this bishop to attack the isolated a3 pawn, so that if this rook ever tries to contest this file, this pawn might be hanging. The queen can of course come into the game, the knight could even swing over in some lines. This bishop of course will have an impact after c4 is played, possibly isolating the pawn here on d3. So those are some of black's positional ideas, and they can be pretty effective, but you also have to remember there's no king over here to win on the queen side. So if black does not succeed in stopping this attack that white's launching against their king, then it's not going to matter what they accomplish on the queen side, they're simply going to get checkmated. White has many ways to continue their attack here, of course. The queen can jump into the attack, the knight can jump into the attack. I have even seen some lines where this bishop can come to e4, either if this d-pawn moves, or even sometimes tactically if that d-pawn doesn't move. Sometimes a well-calculated bishop e4 can be the final ingredient to that white attack on the king side. So that was a good illustration of the ideas for both sides and the King's Indian attack. Of course, there's too many sidelines that both sides have to really cover all of them in depth. That's just the nature of these openings that don't have any early pawn tension. Both sides simply have too many options at their disposal to analyze all of them. One that I do want to point out, though, is back here on move 5. We looked at black playing e6 here. A very major alternative here is getting this bishop outside the pawn chain before playing e6. Black will sometimes play bishop g4 here. And if I had the black pieces, this is probably the option I would choose against this particular setup in the King's Indian attack. I think this bishop is going to help black out a lot in repelling the attack on the king side after it swings back around to g6. Some players don't play this because this bishop can be a target for white's expansion. White can gain some tempos by attacking this bishop, and black might be forced to exchange that bishop off for a knight, and that would give white the bishop pair. But I think the benefits outweigh the risks there, but that's just my personal assessment. Certainly e6 is a very viable move as well. One sample line here might go castle, e6, white plays e4 like they always do, bishop e7, h3, and there's no reason for black to part with the bishop pair right away. Black can simply play bishop h5, and this bishop can help out in defending the king. Finally, let's talk about move orders, because the move order does matter. So far, we've looked at reaching the King's Indian attack by playing knight f3 on move 1, and this does have certain advantages. Number 1, we stop black from playing e5, so they can't go for any setup too easily that involves that pawn on e5, because we have that square under control. And secondly, by avoiding any early pawn tension, by not putting a pawn in the center until we have our whole setup ready, we're really able to play the King's Indian attack no matter what black does, and that's the appeal of this setup to a lot of players. So there's definitely something to be said for starting with knight to f3. But one option that I think is a bit more ambitious, although it might require a little bit more preparation, is to start by playing the king's pawn opening with pawn to e4. Now, if you're going to go for this, you won't be able to play the King's Indian attack against every possible black setup. For example, if black plays d5 right now, the Scandinavian defense, you can't play a King's Indian attack because you can't reinforce this pawn with d3. Your knight's not on d2 yet, and black could simply take on e4, and that's not great for you. You would just have to go into the Scandinavian defense, but for a lot of players that shouldn't be a huge concern. I don't think it takes a whole lot of preparation to be ready to play against the Scandinavian defense. Also, after e4, if black plays e5, I wouldn't recommend going for the King's Indian attack now, although I guess you could still play knight f3 and g3. It's just not very ambitious now, because you're not going to be able to push this pawn to e5. Black has a stable stronghold here in the center, and they're going to get developed very fast. But against most other black setups, you will be able to play the King's Indian attack, and by keeping black guessing whether you're going to play the King's Indian or a normal mainline e4 opening, you might restrict some of their options that they might otherwise have to play if you started with knight f3 on move 1. For example, let's take an example from the Sicilian defense, where black plays c5, white can play here knight to f3, and we know that black has several moves here. Black can play knight c6, or d6, or e6, or g6, and very often white will go into the open Sicilian by playing d4, and of course there's a whole lot of theory there. Some players with white don't like playing the open Sicilian against the setup with the pawn on e6, because this is associated with like the Khan variation, the Taimanov variation. There's some annoying lines where this bishop can come to b4 and pin your knight, because black's not blocking it in yet with d6. But here, you can simply transition to the King's Indian attack. You can play d3, followed by, of course, g3, bishop g2, castle, and knight b to d2. And we see that black has committed this pawn to e6, and now their bishop g4 option no longer exists. So some players here will be happy to play an open Sicilian after d6, but they'll go into the King's Indian attack if black plays e6. Of course, you don't have to do that. You could just play the King's Indian attack no matter what black does here. If black plays d6, there's nothing wrong with still just playing g3 and d3 and going for the King's Indian attack, and that's also often called the closed Sicilian to distinguish it from the open Sicilian. Also, against the French defense, we can play the King's Indian attack. Here, I would recommend the move order with d3 first, so that you can meet d5 with knight to d2, because we know d5 is coming when black plays e6 on move 1, and we want to make sure we get this knight to d2 in time, so black can't just take on e4 and exchange queens. And here we're just going to get a normal King's Indian attack setup. There's not much black can do to avoid it. Black will often play c5 to grab more space, and now we can play knight f3, and it's the same kind of setup we've already seen. Finally, I just want to show one more example, and that's against the Caro-Kann defense. This can be a little bit different because there's some setups where black can put this pawn on e5, but we'll see that that doesn't stop us from playing the King's Indian attack. Here, again, for the same reason as in the French defense, I recommend playing d3 if you want to go for the King's Indian, so that you can meet d5 with knight to d2. And here black can play e5 if they want to. And now black does have a larger share of central space than they often get in the King's Indian, but let's see how this goes. We can play knight f3, they have to defend their e5 pawn, g3, we're just going for the normal setup, knight f6, bishop g2, castle, castle. I think bishop g4 is probably the most annoying line to deal with as white, because black's just developing this bishop and it's going to help defend the king, but we're going to see how white can handle this. The main line here goes h3, forcing this bishop to make a decision, either to give up the bishop pair here by taking on f3, or they can play bishop h5, but if they choose this option, white has a really nice move here in queen to e1. So what's the idea here? We're simply adding reinforcements here to the e4 pawn, and also breaking this pin that the bishop had on this knight so that we can play knight h4, and this knight could try to swing into f5. This is an added option we have because the black pawn's not on e6, the pawn's on e5. So we can try to exploit that and bring this knight to the f5 square, where it can be a key player in our attack. So let's take a look. Knight b to d7, knight h4, and if black is not well versed in this line, it's easy for them to go wrong. If they allowed us to play knight f5 right now, that would be kind of annoying, because how do you deal with this attack on the bishop? You might have to retreat that bishop, or you might have to give up the bishop pair. The best way for black to play, I believe, is to play rook e8 right now, so that they can meet knight f5 with bishop f8. And now black gets to maintain that bishop pair for the time being. We can play knight f3 and try to bring our other knight closer to the king. If they take on e4, that's no problem, we can just take back, and now knight c5 is black's most popular move. They're just attacking the e4 pawn, but white can play either knight h2 or knight h4 to let the bishop defend that pawn. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please make sure you click the link down in the description to visit chesspathways.com and get signed up there. It's totally free to join, only takes 5 seconds, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you sign up. So please let me help you become the best chess player you can be and join our community. Thanks, and I'll see you there.